The river mist hung over the green fork as if the twins had breathed out a long sigh and laid the vapors gently upon the water. Dawn colored the eastern sky a pale wash. The two castles stood gaunt and gray, like old men at either side of a narrow bridge who had forgotten the shape of laughter. Banners clacked in the faint wind, damp as laundry on a line. Steel and leather smelled of rain, and campfires spat thin smoke that drifted and vanished against the stone. Robb Stark sat his gray horse a little apart from the foremost ranks, helm in his lap, wolf-tail cloak rippling behind him. Gray wind paced, uneasy, by the horse's flank, ears pricked toward the east, then north again, as if the great dire wolf kept count of each guard upon the parapets. The host behind Robb, river lords in their river brown and blue, Northmen in sable and gray, hillmen with rough-woven cloaks, murmured and shivered and stamped its feet to drive the damp out of bones. Catelyn watched her son and said nothing. She had said all there was to say in tears and admonitions already. The rest must be borne with a mother's composure, if not a mother's contentment. Walder Frey received them in the great vaulted hall on the western bank. There were candles enough for a marriage, and candles enough for a funeral, and the old lord's eyes made you wonder which he expected. The rafters were crowded with his kin, faces too similar, as if the twins themselves had been jetters of men and women. Walder's daughters and granddaughters and bastards and those born on wedlock's lawful side, all pale and watchful, their mouths pursed like shutters. Lothar Halfmester limped and bowed and simpered. Black Walder smirked and whispered to a cousin. A child somewhere coughed. A mastiff scratched and lay down again, nails clicking. "King in the north," old Walder said, savoring each syllable as a sour man might test a sweet thing, suspicious of what it hid. "You've come back to me, and not empty-handed. This is well. Kings who keep their word are rare as hen's teeth, and I have kept careful count of hens." He chuckled, wheeze and rattle. "So, let us look at you one last time before you pass beneath a septon's talk and a lady's eyes." There was a hush as the women were summoned, and the line of Frey girls advanced like a pale tide. Some were too young, clutching at their skirts with hands that had ink on them. Some were plain in a kindly way. Some had beauty like a spring shining without understanding. Catelyn felt that old, familiar twist under her ribs. Her Ned was not among these faces, and his absence shaded all colors to gray. She watched Robb's mouth set in that stubborn, stark line as he passed down the array, looked as a commander looks, eyes quick, honest. The vows he had broken were not in this hall. They were behind him, along the road of grief. He had mended what could be mended. In that, perhaps, there is honor, she thought. In that, there is a path, if not a path to happiness. Rosalind was 4 from the end. Her dress was pale, her hair a dark ashy brown. There was a fragility to her that was not coyness. She lifted her gaze and it did not falter. She looked at Robb the way a sparrow might look at an eagle when the wind brings them to the same branch. There was music in her fingers. Catelyn saw it at once, the way a girl holds her hands when they have learned to weave a melody and hush a crying child in the same hour. Old Walder's mouth twitched, pleased in some private way. Catelyn did not trust the twitch nor the pleasure, but she trusted the truth of the girl's eyes. "Yes," Robb said softly, too soft for all but those closest to hear. "Lady Rosalind." There were nods. Walder's eyes glittered like beads. "A king who knows his mind. I like a king who can finish a thing he's begun." One of his brood tittered, and Black Walder gave a hiss to silence her. They were wed that afternoon. The septon's voice echoed under the beams, and the candles guttered once, as if blown by some hand beyond hands. The 7 were prayed to: mother, father, smith, maiden, warrior, crone, stranger. Catelyn's hands were cold and wet with sweat. She could see gray wind at the far end of the hall, pacing like a shadow set loose from its body. When Rosalind's small, fine fingers were bound to Robb's in the ribbon, the old lord's mouth twisted again, but his hands trembled, and not for age only. He had weighed much upon this day. The scales filled with gold, with scorn averted, with an old slight soothed, and with the soft miracle of a king for kin. After the feast, the noise swelled and became a wave, a relief and a threat. The twins never held merry sound without a knife secreted somewhere within it. Harp and drum, pipes and a fiddle badly in tune. The cider had too much bite and the wine too little. The great John roared and clapped, and umber men banged their cups against the trestles, and the piper's own pipers fought the Frey music for the air and won. Rosalind ate little, Robb drank less. Walder Frey's sons passed meat and mockery down the tables with the same easy hands. There were a dozen toasts to a dozen grandchildren by a dozen mothers, and all of them Freys. "I would ask," said 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 at Robb's elbow, "to know your pleasure, your grace, on certain small matters of joint defense. Our bridges, after all, are a linchpin. If Sir Davin in the west moves with too much boldness, might we expect? These matters will be addressed," Roose Bolton said quietly, white hands folded, pale eyes flat and veiled. "There is Harrenhal to supply and hold, and there are fords to watch, if certain commands are placed in the right hands." Brynden Tully snorted softly. "Harrenhal's castles have had many right hands, and none of them have weathered a summer storm, much less a winter. It is a place where good sense goes to die of draughts and ill luck. Better to use it as a kennel for the mountain and his curs than a seat for decisions." Caitlin watched the men. There was a new line at the edge of Roose Bolton's mouth lately, an inward-folding thing. He had a habit of stillness that other men mistook for patience, because they did not want to imagine the other thing stillness could be. Robb was grave and careful with his words, and careful too to lean toward his new wife when he spoke, to bring her into the circle of his attention. Caitlin's heart tugged. He is like his father and he is not like his father, she thought, and this is the shape of our world now, new bridges, old stones. When they danced, Rosalind surprised them all. She was light as thistledown, but her steps were sure, and a smile came to her face that did not look forced, not even in this hall where smiles were a kind of coin spent with care. "Your Grace," she said, when the music softened and he bowed her off the floor with a courtesy that made a Frey ant dab at her eyes with a bit of lace. "You were kind to look at me. My Lord Father says I am like water, clear and easily poured, and just as easily spilled." "Then we will be careful not to spill you," Robb said, and for a moment his grin was a boy's grin and winter seemed very far off. At the high table, Walder Frey's bony fingers crept across the cloth, counting. A servant leaned to refill his cup and the old man drew his hand back as if struck, then laughed to show there was no hurt and no anger. "Daughter," he said to a stout, pink-faced girl with a string of amber at her throat, "send for Edmure Tully. If the king is to take one dove from my coat, I'll have a hawk for my own. The Tully owes us more than good words." "Father," the girl said, glancing at Caitlin, "it is not, perhaps not tonight." "Bah!" Walder's lip curled. "You let a fish go unnetted and he'll think it's his right to swim where he will. That's how it is with fish. And Tullus, same coat, if you squint." Edmure, red in the face and generous in his cups, laughed too loudly at a jest he half heard. The blackfish's hand closed over the table's edge until his knuckles whitened. Caitlin set her jaw. There would be another day for that net and that fish. If old Walder sought to bind them with another marriage, better to make the knot where it would hold. Edmure had sown his seed carelessly before. A wife might anchor him and soothe the Frey's ever-present sense of slight. Not tonight, though. Not the very night her son took a wife. Night carried them away like a careful fairy. In chambers perfumed lightly with rushes and cedar, Robb Stark and Rosalind Frey stood facing one another while the candles guttered and a single moth circled, frantic for flame. They spoke first, which was mercy. The words made narrow bridges over the wide water of shyness and fear that can lie between strangers. Rosalind told him of the harp and the way her fingers sometimes bled in winter and grew hard and clever again. Robb told her of the gods wood at Winterfell, the feel of the cold stone, the smell of the leaves. He did not speak of dead fathers or dead brothers or the crack of a headsman's sword. They drank honeyed wine. Outside, the river lapped the pilings as it had lapped pilings 100 years ago. Inside, two lives began to bend toward each other like saplings brought near by a gardener with a length of twine and patience. In the morning, the banners were damp again, and the twins' ladders creaked, and there was war to be resumed. Oxcross lay already in their stories behind them, the Lannister pride broken there like a dropped cup. But the cup was mended, and the West had been cautious since. Much had changed in King's Landing while Robb marched and fought. Wildfire had turned the Blackwater green and monstrous. Stannis Baratheon had withdrawn in smoke and salt. The Rose of Highgarden had twined itself around the Golden Lion. Joffrey Baratheon had a bride-to-be. Sansa Stark had become a piece on a Lannister board that changed hands while she slept. She dreamed of Winterfell that night, in a bed too large, with sheets too smooth to be her mother's weaving. Morning brought a gown of ivory and gold, and her aunt by marriage smiled at her with all the smoothness of a still lake before a storm. Marjorie spoke softly and sweetly and asked about the north as other women ask about a knitting pattern. Sansa answered as a good lady would answer, and afterward retched quietly into a basin while Shae made soft, soothing noises. "You need not be sick with fear," Tyrion Lannister said later, when his uncle and sister were elsewhere and he could be the man he preferred to be. "You need only be careful with it. Think of fear as a wine. You must not drink so much you become sodden and foolish, but a mouthful will steady your hands, and two will loosen your tongue at the right moment. They will marry me to whomever they choose," Sansa said. She did not attempt to keep the iron out of her voice. "They will put a rose in my hair and say it's a crown." "They will try," Tyrion said. "They did not put a rose. They put his ring instead." The gods have an unkind sense of poetry. The day they wed her to Tyrion, there was no wildfire in the sky, only the dull clatter of city carts and the hiss of Ser Meryn's impatient breath in his helm. When Tyrion lifted the veil, he looked at her face as if she were a page he had read before and was searching for a word he had missed the first time. "You are my lady," he said. "It is not the worst fate. It is not the worst man," she answered, and her voice did not tremble. In the Riverlands, ravens flew like soot on the wind. They carried orders and pleas and lies and love. They perched on gallows and thatch. Robb's counsel argued carefully and hard. The Karstarks were a hollow place at the heart of their strength, and no kindness could fill it. Rickard Karstark's sons were dead, and his heart had choked on the bile of that truth. He had stalked the camp like a bear, wounded and old. After Catelyn had loosed the Kingslayer, there had been words sharp enough to shave a man to the bone. Then there had been blood, and a king with a sword in his hand, and justice that did not comfort anyone who had been forced to see it done. The day Robb put down the Lord of Carhold's head upon a block and took it off, the wind blew cold and the Great John had turned away with a sound like a hurt animal. It was the sound of loyalty enduring an unexpected weight. That weight remained. Robb's face afterward had been the face of a man who had flung himself into an icy river to save a child and come up missing skin. "We cannot go north while Moat Cailin is held," Robb said now, tracing the lines of the neck with his forefinger on a stained map. The towers of Moat Cailin were black smudges on the parchment, no hands but still clutching. "We cannot hold this country forever while Tywin sits snug with grain and gold and a rose blooming at his shoulder." "You can bleed him," Bolton murmured, "and when a great beast has bled enough, his head lowers. A rope falls easier then. Harrenhal is a good knife for that purpose." "Harrenhal is cursed," said Lord Jason Mallister. "But curses do not bend bows or set pits. What matters is who lives there and how long they can eat." "The Frey's bridges give us teeth we did not have last month," the Blackfish said. "They'd bite harder if they were our own." "They are not our own," Catelyn said, and her voice cut through their careful masculine measures and weighed as much as any sword. "They are ours because my son is their kin now. That is a slender rope. Treat it as such, and do not hang yourselves by it." Roose Bolton's mouth twitched, just once, in something that might in other men be taken for amusement. "If we bait Tywin out of his lair, we must be certain that bait will not break. What does he need?" "Edmure," Robb said. It was a simple thought, and the kind that made men uneasy because of its simplicity. Tywin could not abide the loose fish that swam upriver when he laid a net in the west. Edmure Tully held Riverrun and the fords and more besides. If Tywin moved in strength to finish the work he had begun on the Green Fork in another summer, if he attempted to pin the trout upon his board, his belly would be open. Robb laid out the way of it. It was like laying sticks for a fire when the wood was damp. Enough sticks, placed right, and stubbornness will make a flame. We must coordinate, Robb said. No more surprises born of pride. 𝒅𝒊𝒄𝒅 colored. He had repelled Tywin once at the stone mill, but in doing so he had ruined a hunting plan that would have brought them ahead for their wall. That misstep lay between uncle and nephew like an untidy pile of branches that no one had yet bothered to clear away. I will stand where you put me, 𝒅𝒊𝒄𝒅 said, and it was a man's promise and not a boy's. Catelyn loved him for it and feared for him both at once. Then you will stand at the fords, Robb said, and you will draw him. While you go where? Roosa's voice was very mild, like linen drawn smoothly over a wound. North. Robb's palm flattened upon the neck. To the Crannigs and their spears and their poisoned darts. To Howland Reed, who is my father's friend. To Moat Cailin, which we will take by guile and not by valor. For men who choose valor there die senselessly. I will not leave my home in ashes while my father's bones bleach in the south. Once the neck is open again, we may choose our road. With the Frey's strength, we can harry and withdraw. With the Frey's strength, said a new voice, nasal and amused. Your grace may also wish to bind the matter of Riverrun more firmly to such towers as my lord father has raised. There is the matter of my sister Valda. The Blackfish's chair scraped. Catelyn's hand found his wrist under the table and pressed once. Your lord father, she said to Lothar Halfmaster, may call himself satisfied with the match he has been given. Lothar's smile wavered, then resumed. Satisfied, my lady, a word with many gradations. Robb looked at him. 𝒅𝒊𝒄𝒅 will marry Lothar, but not before he has done what he must. This is a river problem first. We can make it a bedding problem after. It was decided thus. Ravens went out. Men sharpened hooks and checked bowstrings until they hummed like plucked hair. Scouts rode like needles through a weave. The Freys posted their men on the eastern bridge, on the western, on the lengths of causeway where a horse can slip and die so quickly that you think the mud itself is a mouth. Walder counted and pretended he did not hear the counting in his own chest. Arya heard it too. Not the counting, the hoofbeats. Rather, she had slept in a tree that night, back to a trunk, needle tucked at her side. Lemoncloak snored with his mouth open and caught flies. Angwi had made a fire of damp wood and coaxed it past sulkiness into a grudging flame. Soft-footed men, those, gentle with bread, cruel with tyrants. Thuras had shown her a trick with a coin that made her laugh for the first time in a winter's worth of nights. But this was the Hound. She knew the shape of him on the road before she saw the horse. The burned face, the scorn, the liquid way he moved despite his size, as if someone had poured a night into a leather bag and it had learned to walk. He had come in half-light like bad news. You're worth more than the other beggar's girl, he said, wiping last night's ale out of his beard with a hand that had strangled men. The Wolf King will pay for a sister, or the fish will. If they won't, there's always lions who like stark cubs on their chain. Arya spat and ran and did not get far. The time of running had become the time of riding with a rope looped around her waist like an unspoken threat. You scream and I'll gag you, the Hound told her. You try to cut me with that little needle and I'll take it away and so your lips shut with it. I have killed a man, Arya said. The thread of pride in her voice was as fine as the string of a lute. I've killed more than I've drunk, the Hound said without boasting. But if it's counting you want to do, girl, save it for your prayers. He took her toward Riverrun because coin is a compass in all weathers if you listen to it. When she saw the Tully Towers from the hill above the Red Fork, her heart did something painful in her chest and she did not cough it out because she was Arya Stark and did not cry any longer for the sake of crying. The Hound made for a ford the men said would be watched. It was watched. River lords in boots that leaked, with spears they had sharpened on their steps while children slept with ears blocked against the scraping. A gray banner broke the afternoon. A dire wolf bared its fangs to a golden sun in tattered cloth. The riders moved with the easy purpose of men who have done something often enough to grow careless of the shape of it, and that carelessness is a kind of grace. The first arrow clattered against the Hound's shield. He laughed. a bark meant to frighten birds, and fixed Arya to the saddle with one hand as if she were a sack of grain. "Hold!" cried a voice like the river when it is forced between stones. "Hold, or I'll have you gut shot and then ask you your business." The hound raised his chin. "I am 𝒉𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒄 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒄. I seek a purse and a lord with a taste for long odds. I bring him a better one. Show your face. Do I look like I hide it?" Clegane bared his teeth. Arya was hauled forward like an offering, and for a heartbeat she saw a face that could be hers if a mirror were left in the rain. An older woman's face with tully bones with stark eyes. Catelyn's fingers trembled before they steadied. The rope came off. Her arms around her daughter's bony shoulders were fierce as winter. Arya did not cry. She made a sound instead, low and angry and frightened, and buried her face in her moth. Urs' cloak where it smelled faintly of smoke and the oil they used to keep mail from rusting. Later there were words. Later there was a kiss for her hair, and bread, and a room with a door that shut. Later, Arya slept and dreamed of a courtyard and a boy with a broom who had never been anything but kind. The rope they cut from the hound's hand became a leash of sorts. They did not kill him. "We may need dogs yet," Brynden Tully said dryly. "If we cannot find them, we must make do with hounds." Robb and Roslin came to Riverrun in a spray of spray and hoofbeats, the river on their boots, the frecks of rain on their faces. Gray wind leaped from the shallows to the bank in a bound that made men give ground without meaning to. Robb spoke as a king and a brother and neither. The weight of all three ways of speaking lay upon him. When he saw Arya, he touched her hair and glanced once at Catelyn over the child's head. Something unclenched in his mouth. The campaign began to knit itself as wool does in skilled hands. Edmure set men at the fords and baited Tywin's pride in careful measure, raising a torch at certain hours to suggest a vulnerability, lowering it at others to imply hidden strength. Scouts carried back news of banners moving like a field of flowers in the west. 𝒔𝒊𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒄, the remnants of Stafford's grand folly on the Boneway field. They were not fools only because they had been made wise by death and the taste of ash. Tywin himself sat silent in the halls where other men sang and made his decisions by counting and the flicker of a candle that had never burned down to surprise him. He starved wolves with ledger books. Robb did not intend to give him a feast. He left Edmure strong enough to fight and weak enough to tempt, then turned his column north with a quiet that would have pleased any mummer. The Freys sent companies whose captains were affable in the daylight and careful with their silence when the fire burned low. Roslin rode only part of the way. Catelyn pressed a kiss to her cheek and sent her back under a guard that she would have sent twice as stout if she had had twice the men. There was a new softness at Roslin's mouth when she looked at Robb's back. Whether it was hope or sorrow, Catelyn could not tell. Across the river, a shepherd watched them go and later told a sell's word over ale that the king rode as if he rode over winter's very neck. In the neck, the land altered like a mood. The air smelled of peat and secrets. Pools lay like dusk upon the earth, and reeds murmured, and frogs made the ancient sound they have always made while men build and burn cities. Men disappeared if they stepped where a man should not step. Horses balked. A child could be standing in a place you had just looked and then be gone, and you could spend the day calling and hear only the slop of mud. The crannogmen came out of green water and out of thick mist with eyes as pale as their waters and spears too short for knights to believe in until the points were under a gorget. "Howland Reed," Robb said when the marsh parted and the small man came, all sinew and bone, with a smile that traveled no farther than the corners of his mouth. "My father spoke of you with the voice he kept for words he did not squander." "I keep old oaths," Howland said. "They keep me. You wear your father's look when you speak of the North, your mother's when you speak of duty. This is a place where both are useful." Moat Cailin was not a castle so much as a scab. It had never healed, and it bled men. The three black towers rose above the quag like teeth in a jaw with the gums rotted away. The Ironborn sat within them, salted and sullen. Their eyes reddened with the smoke their own fires set in their own throats. They jeered the first day and grew quiet when the reeds around them moved in ways reeds do not move. A man went pissing in the dark and came back with a frog spear through his palm and could not say whom he had seen, for there had been no one there. Dreams plagued them. Slick dreams of drowning and of snakes whose scales were not scales but leaves. Robb did not order his men to run at walls. He made the moat itself into a wall, and Howland slipped through it. In the second week, a cough began among the Ironborn. Men coughed and brought up things that smelled wrong, even in that place where everything smelled wrong. Clay pots sailed out of darkness and broke upon tower stones, and the wind that rose for an hour carried an itch that men could not ever scratch enough. He sent a raven with a promise to the garrison. Bread and life if they yielded, death or worse if they did not. Ramsay Snow's letter arrived the same morning, mottled with damp, smelling faintly of tallow though it had traveled in a raven's leg. It spoke in a round, careful hand about Winterfell and about Theon Greyjoy. There were words about flaying that Ramsay had written as a priest writes God, with reverence. Roose Bolton read it and said nothing and folded it into his sleeve. Robb looked at him and wondered at the shape of a man who could wear such messages as if they were kerchiefs. "Once we are through," Robb said, "I will take the Dreadfort's levy in hand. Your son may answer for his deeds." Roose had a smile that did not move his eyes. "If he lives," he said, "I will instruct him on duty." The Ironborn broke on the 12th day, not because they feared death. No Ironborn had ever been born who feared it more than they feared the thought of living as other men live, but because they had begun to believe the ground itself wished to rise and swallow them down, because bread and life mean something even when a man pretends they do not, and because one of them, a man with thick wrists and weeping sores, saw in a dream a girl with hair the color of straw twist a rope of marsh grass and tie it round his throat. He woke with the taste of green in his mouth and told their captain he would not die in a place that dreamed of eating him. They came out with hands raised. A Crannog youth blew a little flute and men stepped where he stepped. It was a dance that killed slower than swords but killed all the same if you lost the step. The towers were given up to men who did not drink much and slept with half an ear awake because this place had no kindness in it for pride. The neck opened. Men cheered, and it sounded perfunctory and thin. The neck did not like cheering. It took men's voices and made them damp and kept them. North. North was a promise wrapped in a wound. Winterfell stood black-ribbed against the pale sky, its towers bitten and burned. The gods would still had shadows you could trust, which is a thing you cannot say for every shadow. Robb dismounted at the heart tree and put his palm upon its face. He did not ask it for anything. He stood until the light altered and then altered again. "I will build here again," he said. "Not in the same way, in a way that remembers." When word of Joffrey's wedding and death came in a noise the city called a bell and men elsewhere called a gull's cry brought inland by a chance wind. It struck campfires all over the kingdoms like a thrown spark. Sansa was gone, men said. The imp had killed his nephew with poison and flown. The lion did not bleed and did not roar but made a sound like steel being put away. At Riverrun, Catelyn read the letter twice more than she needed to. Her daughter, gone. From a lion's claw to a shadow's hand. She went to the castle's parapet and watched geese form and unform. They had been safe only when they were moving, it seemed. That was a kind of lesson. Later she spoke to Robb, and the words they did not say sat polite and unserved between them at the table where they divided bread. "Littlefinger," Brynden said. "They say he is gone to the Vale." "He will make the Vale a nest to suit himself," Catelyn said, and tasted the gall of Lysa's name in her mouth. "He will turn the Ares flint to wax between his fingers. He will have my daughter to hand if it pleases him." Robb's hand closed and opened. "I will not divide our host for a chase after one shadow, mother. The Iron Throne will be weaker now." Tywin's strength was often the strength he gave to others by making them fear to displease him. "Tywin Lannister still lives," Catelyn said, and then a day came when that sentence was a lie. In a place beneath his own roof that he had walked all his life, Tywin died on a chair that many men had envied. The words of it came like children who have been told to sit quiet and failed. Tyrion vanished, as small men do when they are not looked for and look for themselves instead. Cersei wept in a manner that made people decide to offer her things. Marjorie smiled and then went silent. The city breathed out fear and breathed in curiosity. Cakes tasted better for a week. Robb's camp breathed opportunity. There are battles a sword may win and wars that swords only survive. A boy in a leather jerkin brought a letter with a broken lion seal. Lord Tyrell, Robb read aloud to his council. Sirs Hightower and Rowan, Lord Mace's goodwill, his desire for peace, the thought. Robb's voice remained even, a snowfield unmarked by a footprint. That the north might be left to its own in truth if the riverlands bend knee and the fords be open. That Tommen is a child and not to blame for a father's and a grandsire's sin. The Tyrells do not give, the great John said. They sell. Every man sells, Roose Bolton observed. Honors, daughters, wheat, and winters. Sometimes a man sells by taking. Sometimes he buys by folding his hands. Catelyn looked down at the map. There is one thing a rose cannot sell itself out of. Winter. It will come to us before it comes to them, but it will come to them all the same. Robb called for Brandon Tallheart and Hal Mullen and men whose names bards did not sing but who kept to their feet when the ground was treacherous. He sent ravens north and east and west, asking for bread and the word yes. Word came back from White Harbor on parchment dotted with grease from some feast. Wyman Manderly's words were blunt as the man himself, but his promises were large as a man who has counted insults and not forgotten. If you are to be a king, Wyman wrote, then be one. If you are to be a lord in all but name, then say it and let us bake smaller pies. He had, then, a choice that was all choices in a single shape. Bend and keep the north whole, and leave the south to its games of chairs. Stand and bleed, and perhaps build a nation that could hold winter without starving. He took Roslyn's hand and asked her what she thought. She laughed, startled. Your Grace, I have played the harp in rooms where men whispered of coins and counties. When I look at you now, I do not think of rooms. I think of the land. When the floods come, our people will not ask if the water belongs to a king or a child or a gardener. They will ask for someone to build the levee. You speak like a fry with her feet in mud, he said. I am a fry with my feet in your mud, she said. He called a council with fewer men and more air in it. We will have peace with Tommen for a winter, he said, and we will have the north. We will leave the south to its own feast and famine. The riverlands are our kin. They will not be ground to powder between Tyrell and Lion. Edmure will kneel for them. I will not. I will go home. And while I am there, we will make the walls south no worse than it is, and perhaps a little better. Bolton's eyes were as unreadable as knives laid side by side. You will let yourself be named Lord again, he said. I will call myself what I am, Robb said. King to my people, perhaps, while the snows last. Lord to the south, if their ears cannot hear the other word without taking to blood. The name matters less than the roof that keeps us dry. My father taught me that a lord who quarrels over titles in a storm will drown with a crown on his brow. And the Lannisters will accept this? Jason Mallister asked, skepticism a crease in his voice. The Lannisters will accept what the Tyrells tell them to accept until Cersei learns how to say no more emphatically. The Tyrells will accept whatever allows their bread to rise and their sons to stay rich. If they know the Riverlords will withdraw their teeth in exchange for breathing, they will declare the bargain sound. If they think they can have our lands besides, they will come with a smile and knives. I mean to keep them where they are, knives and smiles both on the other side of the trident. He sent Edmure to the twins with a letter wrapped in another letter, and those in turn wrapped in a smile and in Blackfish Bryndon's eye for men. Old Walder made a show of affront and then a show of magnanimity, which are the same show with different costumes. In the end, he declared that he had always wanted a Tully son-in-law who could keep the hall warm with daughters. Edmure's face was briefly the face of a fish that has been placed on a board and tapped with a knife at the nape. Roslyn embraced a sister and cried, and afterward Catelyn kissed her brow, for she had learned that kindness is a better soldier than pride when you fight an old man's spite. The man who came down from the wall with a letter bound to his arm had frost in his beard, though it was not yet so cold in the south you could keep meat on a sill. He spoke of wildlings like a tide, and of a man who called himself king beyond the wall, and of ravens with eyes like grief. Lord Stark, he said, forgetting the other name in the presence of the older, truer one. The night gathers. Robb read the letter. rough tongue moving against his teeth as he worked at 𝒅𝒄 there. 𝒑𝒂💏 Baratheon, he said at last, has taken the wall in his hand and says he will be its sword. He asks for men and for bread. He says the true war is now at last begun. Catelyn closed her eyes. She saw a blue rose opening on a wall of ice, a dream she had not dreamed, and yet had held in her heart once for a man who had stood with her in a godswood and bade her believe in what she could not see. Send him both, she said. Send him both and ask him for nothing in return but that he stand between the dead and our doors. Roslin's fingers found Robb's under the table. He did not look at her, but he tightened his hand around hers once. A quick and ordinary gesture that in this hall of maps and stones and duty felt like a bell rung at dawn. Winter came down the King's Road slower than their patience wore. It came all the same. The accord with Tommen's regency was written on a paper and signed with 3 kinds of ink and 4 kinds of disdain. It was ratified with carts of grain and a single kiss of courtesy at a parley where men counted arrows out of the corners of their eyes. The river lords breathed. The Tyrells preened. Cersei drank and frowned so hard at her own cup that the wine must have soured for fear of displeasing her. The Freys counted. They always counted. Roose Bolton counted too, but differently. He had not gotten the thing Tywin had promised him in another world. There had been whispers, Catelyn understood, of a letter naming him Warden of the North if he delivered certain heads. But that promise had died on a privy along with the man who made it. Roose had a son with a skinning knife and appetites that made the skin crawl on one's back to think of them. He had a wife now as well. Walder Frey had given a Valda thick as cream to him to bind the old Dreadfort to the new twins, and Roose had smiled and said he liked a good measure. Catelyn had watched him put his hands upon the world as a man puts hands upon cloth. He means to cut and sew and make into a garment that will fit him and no one else. He struck once, because men like him must. It is their nature to test the edges when the room grows quiet. A courier died on the road north of Barrowton with a dozen small cuts on his body and a piece of flayed skin in his mouth that had once been stamped with a wolf. A village near the Weeping Water whispered of a pale lord who came with 20 men and took 10 boys and gave 10 sacks of grain. "We are at peace," Robb said, the first time, the second, the third. "If we shake it, the snow will fall upon our heads." These things, he paused. Howland Reed had taught him to hear the land. The land was not at peace. It shifted underfoot in little slippages. Then a snow came that did not leave a small one, then a larger. The wall sent word with icicles on it that did not melt even in a warm room. "We are hard-pressed," the letter said. "If you are what your fathers were, you will send men with all speed." It was signed by a Lord Commander with a simple hand. Robb stood in the yard at Winterfell that had no more boys practicing their spearwork because boys who should only have been practicing had been sent south years ago, and many had not returned. He looked up into the white silent sky. Roslin had his son in her arms. The child slept as if winter were nothing but a darker version of night. "I will go," he said. There was a cry among the men, not a cheer. Cheering is for feasts. This was something else. A knot of feeling that made men glance toward their packs as if the sound itself had weight and might require carrying. "You are a king," the great Jon said bluntly, raw affection in the rude. "And kings belong at the head of things." "I am a Stark," Robb said. "That is the name the Night's Watch will hear when they open the gate, if they do not know my face through the snow. There is work enough for each of us. I will not keep it all." He left Roslin with a promise he meant to keep, and with laughter because it is a shield as sturdy as any iron if it is given freely. He kissed his son's brow. He looked once into the godswood and felt the prickle of eyes upon him that were not precisely eyes. Then he rode. He rode past men who touched their lips and then their hearts. He rode past villages where people put their hands over their chimney pots to keep the warmth in longer. He rode through nights that cracked ice underfoot and days that made the breath of his horse look like smoke. Gray wind ran before, then beside, then was gone for a day and came back with snow on his muzzle and something like hunger in his gaze that Robb did not wish to look too long upon. At the wall, the wind was a living thing that tried to take men out of their armor. The gate rose and the men on the other side had faces as dry as bark. They said the word king without sneer or awe. Stannis stood as if he had grown at this very spot, gloved, drawn, with a fire in a brazier beside him that did not find purchase on the air the way fires do further south. He had a man with a smuggler's hands at his shoulder and a woman with eyes like coals set in a pale face a few paces behind, and the way she looked at Robb made him think of prayers spoken too loud. The realm was the word Stannis used most often, as if by saying it enough he might make it more real than a winter night. "You come as a vassal," he said, the first breath. "All men south of the wall. I come as a man who will die on this ice if I am not careful," Robb said. "If the realm is a house, my lord, then this wall is its roof. I will not haggle over who owns the beams while the snow falls." Stannis's mouth might have twitched. Perhaps it was the wind. "Very well," he said. "For now I will accept men and bread and counsel. If you do not cringe, I will not waste breath in making you bend. There is this manse to be dealt with, and there are worse words than manse in the mouths of men who cannot speak, because their tongues have frozen. They fought a battle that was nothing like the songs. The wildlings came at night and day both, broken and brave, with giants who had eyes like old wells. The wall answered with rocks and arrows and fire. A boy from Carhold died with a grin on his face because he had struck a giant's knee with an axe before he went under. Robb learned to sleep in the shape of a cloak and wake in the shape of a king again, over and over, until the shapes blurred and the man beneath them was tired to his marrow and yet had something there that did not tire. It was not pride, nor even honor. It was the stubborn love of a land and the stubborn truth of his name. A Stark is a word you can say against cold, and sometimes the cold answers back and sometimes it doesn't. He said it anyway. When he came down from the wall that first winter, thinner, his eyes burned deeper into his face. There were Freys at the bar Rolands with smiles like thin soup. Lothar had a letter in his sleeve and an argument on his tongue. "Your Grace," he said, drawing the words out. "The crossings will be manned," Robb said, "and provisioned. You will be paid the price we agreed upon for every man who passes and every horse, and more in winter. My queen will see to the accounts. If you have other counts you wish me to hear, bring them. Bring them all." He did not wait to be chiseled to stone by the petty. He kept moving. Catelyn did the chiseling in his stead when it must be done. She had learned to smile at Freys with a mouth that could bite and not let go. Rosalind, whose hands now bore the small calluses of a mother, kept ink and tallies and made certain candles were counted as carefully as arrows. "You marry a Frey for bridges," Catelyn told her once, in a rare moment alone by the fire, "and you stay married to one for lists." "And for love," Rosalind said, surprising her. It was not a girlish, blushing confession. It was the statement of a woman who had found that a man who counts wolves does not always count kisses and must sometimes be reminded gently to keep one ledger with the other. "Do not laugh, my lady. There is as much war in a heart as there is in a hall." Catelyn did not laugh. She took Rosalind's hand and thought, "Grief is a country. We who survive must learn the tongues spoken there. Another spring might come." She had not believed it once. Beyond the trident, the great game digested its own tale. Cersei took lovers and lost kings and drank the dregs of her own spite and called it wine. Marjorie turned her face to the light and let girls follow her and then turned that girlhood into a kind of guard. The faith fasted itself into a fever. Ironborn rioted and were quieted and rioted again. The Freys remained slippery, but their slipperiness was constrained by the fact that they would slide from the feast if they slid too far. Walder counted, and sometimes, late at night, he also listened to the reeds and wondered how many dinners he had left to enjoy. On a day of knives in the sky and ice in the wind that slipped under the firs like an unwelcome hand, Robb stood in the yard and watched his son take 3 uncertain steps and then sit down hard with a grunt that made men smile without meaning to. Arya, long-limbed and skeptical of most happiness, let herself laugh out loud. She had taken to riding out with the Winterfell men and coming back with snow in her hair and a new bruise each day. She spoke sometimes of Braavos as a place only a fool would ignore and of faces as masks and masks as faces. She also fed the kennel girls' pups with a gentleness that undid Catelyn's breath in her chest. Bran's name was not spoken often. It was given to the kind of silence that dignifies and does not empty. He was beyond their walls and their roads, north of north, following a dream that smelled of earth and bone. The ravens did not bring news of him because there are places ravens do not go. In the great hall a harp sounded. Roslin's fingers had found the strings again after months in which they had found only the soft, demanding work of motherhood and the crisp, careful work of keeping a keep. The song was one Robb did not know. It was not one of the old northern ones about ice and honor. It was softer, and there was a melancholy to it, but not a sorrow. He stood in the entry and listened. She looked up at him, and the corners of her mouth turned in a way he had come to know. Not a smile, not exactly, but that small assent a woman gives to her own choice, which is rarer in the world than men like to confess. "We will have to fight again," Robb said. It was not a complaint. "We will," she agreed. "And you will again stand in rooms where men ask you to count things they call important. When you are done counting, come to me. I will remind you of the things you cannot count." He went to her. Outside, snow wrote its slow script across the yard. In the heart tree's face, the lines did not alter. Far to the south, men traced circles around each other with gold thread and then cut the thread and called it victory. Far to the north, in a darkness that did not end when you shut your eyes, a cold older than any lord waited with more patience than any man. Caitlin walked the wall and looked out at the white. She thought of Ned with a force that was both pain and warmth, like laying your hands upon a stone that has stood in winter for 1,000 years and finding that somehow it holds a little sun. She had not imagined this life. She had imagined less joy and more grief, or more joy and less grief, and had gotten instead an equal measure and a son who had learned to be made of a little iron and a little kindness, both. Down in the yard, Arya taught the stable boy a trick with a blade that would end with both of them grazed and laughing and the master-at-arms shouting. In the kitchen, a woman kneaded bread and sang a song her mother had sung and her mother before her. The wall stood. The twins stood. The river ran. The wolves hunted by moonlight and men by day. There was a king in the north and a queen who kept his books and his heart, and old men who counted their dinners and young men who counted their scars, and the winter that would fall upon them without favor and without mercy. There are victories the bards do not care to sing, because they require a lifetime and a ledger and the patience to love a place that has never loved anyone back with anything but weather. When the spring came, it did not trumpets. Came one day with a drip that outlasted the freeze, another with a crow that found a worm, another still with a thaw that made the moat smell bad and the flowers try their luck. Robb went with his son to the godswood and put the boy's palm upon the heart tree and said the names of those who had gone before. Ricard, Brandon, Eddard. Robb said them like a man stacking stones to make a cairn that will keep wolves away and also mark a grave. The boy looked bored first and then solemn and then bored again. He was a Stark and a boy, both. A rider came hot-foot from the south with a tale of new war but not yet, of men who believe that peace is not a door you can close but merely a hinge that must be greased. The Tyrells had taken offense, the Lannisters had taken a purse, the Faith had taken heat, the Ironborn had taken a ship. "We have not finished counting," the rider said, and wiped his face and grinned as if he liked being the first to tell bad news. "We never will," Robb said. He smiled also, the slow, true smile of a tired man who has chosen his work and will do it well as he can. He lifted his son and set him upon Grey Wind's back for a moment. The dire wolf stood as still as stones and then huffed once, offended and amused. Roslin laughed behind her hand and then put the hand down and did not hide her laughter after all. Walder Frey died in his bed 3 summers later because some men do. His brood got one another's throats in a cautious way, and the twins creaked under the weight of too many scowls. A boy from the Green Fork married a girl from the White Knife, and they were happy for 6 months and content for 6 years, and then had a tragedy and then an ordinary day, and in the sum of it they would call themselves fortunate. Edmure grew a stomach and then a daughter and sometimes wisdom. The Blackfish went downriver in a skiff one morning and came back at dusk with 3 trout and a story that made even the Frey's humor sound generous. Sansa in the Vale learned to make her voice a silk rope and then a steel chain. She never once wrote to her brother, though she thought of it 3 times a year, and he never faulted her for it out loud or in the privacy where we make most of our faulting. Arya went away a while and came back and went away again. When she was there, she would sit with Robb in the hall sometimes, both of them at ease in silence, a brother and a sister who had learned to put their sorrow in their sheaths and draw it only when it was useful. "You did not die," she said to him once, and it sounded like a rebuke and a benediction both. "No," he said, "not then." He would, in the end, like every man. There would be other winters and other wars and other names carved and spoken. He would see sons come to manhood and a daughter whose laugh put Roslin's harp to shame. He would see a giant stand on the wall and wave at men with the slow humor that is either ours or theirs when life is simple. He would sit at a table and count candles and crumbs and call it rule and be right enough. Once, in deep winter, when the wind made a sound like wool being torn and the sky had forgotten the sun, Robb went out to the gods' wood alone and stood. He heard the river under the ice, not a song, not a speech, nothing a bard would take up and polish, only the strong old conversation of water and stone. He found himself repeating his father's words in his head, although he had not set out to do so. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. He thought of all the sentences he had passed and all the swords he had swung and all the ones he had laid down. He thought of Walder Frey and of a girl with a harp and of a woman with auburn hair who had forgiven more than most men ever think to ask for and had mourned more than any woman should be asked to bear and had kept on living as if the world were worth the trouble. He thought of the boy he had been and of the king he had not quite been and of the man he was. Gray wind came like a shadow at his side. The wolf pressed his flank briefly to Robb's thigh and then moved off, white breath writing itself into the air for a moment before it was erased. Robb put his palm upon the heart tree's rough cheek. It was cold. It was constant. Told him nothing. He found he did not need it to tell him anything. He had his own answers now, and none of them were simple, and all of them were enough. The ravens came before dawn, black flecks against a sky that had not quite remembered blue. They struck the snow with their shadows first, and then their wings. One lit upon the merlin above the gatehouse and complained to the winter in a voice like hinges. Another found the rookery with the simple faith of birds and the complicated purpose of men. Maester Colrin, leaner now than when he had come, the fat worked out of him by the slow industry of cold, took the leather tube and warmed it between his hands before he broke the wax. He went to Robb, who was awake already. The king sat at the long table with the map unrolled and waited at the corners by knives. The candles burning so low their stubs had become pits lit with sullen suns. Gray wind lay at his feet, and every so often the dire wolf's ear flicked. As if in a dream he corrected a lesser wolf for an error of swagger. "My lord," the maester said, and Robb looked up, iron-scraped and steady-eyed. From the wall, the seal was crude, a smear of black, pressed with a signet that had known too many hard knocks. The hand was plain, direct, a man's hand that had learned the alphabet late and made it serve without flourishes. Robb read once and then once again, because there is a way of reading for sense and another of reading for weight. "Lord Commander Snow," he said aloud, and the words were strange and not strange in his mouth. The room seemed to lean toward the name. Caitlin arrived with her shawl about her shoulders, and that expression she wore when the morning came embroidered with tasks she would have preferred to rip out. She rested her palm on the back of her son's chair, and for a breath Robb rested his head against her hand, just as he had at 5 and at 15 when he thought no one saw. "He writes of hard home," Robb said, "of dead things that move and live things that eat bark and a wind that steals the breath from children's mouths. He asks for ships. He asks for bread. He will take men if we can send them." Caitlin lowered herself into a chair with grace earned by years. "We will send both," she said. "What we can." "What we can," Robb echoed. He straightened in the chair and the boy was gone. A king regarded a map knowing it could not be coaxed to kindness with a smile. They sent to White Harbor that morning. Wyman Manderley would answer in meat and men, as he had promised, with a word that meant something because it had been paid for. The merman's court had fat stores even in lean times. Its wharves bit the white knife with stone teeth that had been set and reset over 300 winters. White Harbor was the one northern town that did not look like it owed the earth apologies. Within the week, the snow relented enough to permit a party to ride, wrapped in layers of fur that turned men briefly into bears. Robb went because he would not send for what he could ask himself. Caitlin went, for he was her son and her king, and because there had been a time when lords who loved honor were murdered in hall and bed alike, and she had learned that presence is a shield no words can match. Arya did not ask to go. She had been taking her supper on the kennel steps lately, cross-legged, sharing meat with a bitch about to whelp. Her eyes were on somewhere else, and the somewhere else had a taste of salt to it. The road to White Harbor was a white scar stitched with the black thread of trees. Winter made sounds strange. Men's laughter carried too far and then not at all. A horse's snort hung in the air like a thing with weight. The first glimpse of the town was a line of smoke laid against the low sky, and then the lift of masts as if a pine forest had found courage to stand in water. The new keep's pale stone rose from snow like a promise kept and paid for. Wyman received them upon a chair carved like a sea beast dragging up from depth, his belly a great dome under green velvet, his jowls quivering when he laughed and when he did not. He struggled to lift himself, and Robb waved him back down, and the courtesy pleased the lord enough that 7 dishes came at once from the kitchens, steaming like a miracle. "You've come to pluck my gulls, your grace," Wyman said, fingers spread upon the arms of his chair. "Ships, bread, and men. That's what gulls are to some in winter, fat birds to be taken with stones." "To ask," Robb said, "not to pluck, and to promise. You will not send men to a wall without bread to eat and boots to wear. The watch will pay you what it owes, and I will pay what they cannot." Wyman's eyes went thoughtful and sharp at once, as a fish's do when it decides whether a fly is a fly. "Your promises have the look of things that are kept. I have, it happens, a few ships I do not mind sending into waters that bite. There is a thing as well, something I thought to hold until spring. If spring is a thing that exists for us, but—" and here his finger tapped once, twice against the whalebone on his chair arm, "needs must be met in the season they come." He clapped, and men brought forth a prisoner who walked as if he had learned his balance upon a deck. He was gaunt as winter itself, and his beard had gone from black to iron filings scattered across his jaw. He wore the onion on his breast with the easy shame of pride that looks like humility. "Ser 𝒂𝒊𝒂𝒏𝒈, Wyman said, "or lord, if one cares for the kind of honors a king lately lost in the south dispenses. A smuggler, if you ask the wind." His jowls shook with his smile. He came with talk of a king and a cause. "I told him I have had my fill of kings whose borders are cakes they cut with other men's knives. Then I kept him. A useful man is like salt. You do not set him on the shelf merely because you have not yet chosen the meat." Davos bowed, and his eyes were the frank, direct eyes of a man who has done the wrong thing knowing it to be wrong and the right thing knowing the cost. "Your grace," he said, "I carry King Stannis's words, but I brought my own besides. The wall needs hands. Stannis means to supply them with swords. He would have the North's friendship if it can be had. I have given him what I can spare," Robb said, and Davos inclined his head as if a ledger had been balanced in a way he approved. "And we will give more. The watch rights of Hardhome." "Aye," Davos said softly. "Hardhome is where hope goes to smoke. We went close once, years ago, with Lyseni in our wake and iron in our bellies. Even then, the place had a stink to it that no salt could cure. This winter makes old stinks new." Wyman lifted a hand. "There is another matter," he said, as if he had only just recalled the smallest thing. "A boy with a dagger's attention came to my city before last harvest, thin as a rope and twice as stubborn. He belonged to that Greyjoy girl with the hawk stare they took at Deepwood." "Asha," Robb said. The name tasted of iron and smoke, of longships and loss. "What of her?" "My men captured her and 10 besides at Deepwood Motte," Wyman said. "And if I had a shore for every time she tried to shame us with talk of the sea, I'd be lord of 10 harbors. She sent the boy south once the chains were on her wrists. He would not talk until he saw a Stark banner. He would not write either, but he can point at a map." He pointed to a place written more in rumor than in any maester's decent hand. "Skagos." Caitlyn's fingers tightened on the back of Robb's chair. "Osha," she said at once, at last. and her voice tripped over the name as if it had been waiting too long to be used. She took Rickon there when Winterfell fell. Davos's eyes flickered, understanding brightening there in a quick, human way that had nothing to do with banners. In the south, he said, a rumor is worth less than a pie that's been sat upon. In the north, a rumor with boots upon it is worth 2 ravens. If the lad lives, your grace. If the boy is yours and breathing, then there are dues to be paid and oaths to be renewed with bread and salt as well as ink. Robb looked to Catelyn. He did not hide the boy that rose in him for a heartbeat. The boy who had tackled his little brother in the snow and been tackled back, both of them howling like pups. It went as quickly as it came. If, he said softly, if we do not let our hearts pull us through snow into the river, we use a rope and we bind it to a thing that will not move. Davos Seaworth, will you take ship and go to Skagos, with the man who pointed and with men I trust to find their own feet in a place where the lines between map and marsh blur? Davos's mouth twitched with a smile too tired to be anything but true. He said, I was born to go where decent men would prefer not to be sent. If a boy waits for me there, I'll bring him. If there's naught but bones, I'll bring those too. Wyman nodded in a large, gracious way. I have a longship that can cut a narrow passage where a galley would founder, he said. She is named the Sweetwater, and her captain is too proud to call himself a smuggler and too clever to be anything else. He will not fail for want of cunning. He may fail for want of luck. The sea eats �𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒄. Men like sweetmeats when it is in the mood. I will send Tormund Whiteblade, Robb said, naming a man who had learned patience in the neck and kept it, and 2 of Lord Manderly's best to guide and witness, and a handful of my own quiet men with more ears than mouths. Wyman's jowls lifted with a satisfied nod. Onions and wolves on one deck, he said. We shall make the South speak of that yet. They made their plans by the hourglass and the smell of stew turning to a skin in the pot. Davos looked at maps with the tilted head of a man who reads water by the edges of it and not the line drawn upon it. The boy Wex came in, blinked like an owl in the lamplight, and pointed again to the gray-green smear of Skagos, to the scar of a bay there, to a spit of rock like a broken tooth. He tried to form the words with his lips and gave up. His hands told the story faster and clearer. Catelyn watched his fingers draw a child upon the air and then draw a wolf. She turned away and smiled at nothing and pressed her knuckles to her teeth. They sailed for mornings later, under a sky that looked like iron hammered thin. The Sweetwater's prow cut black water that kvetched and slapped as if affronted by the presumption. Robb stood on the quay as long as he could see the sails. Catelyn stood beside him and did not speak, and when the ship finally found the horizon as a small blot and then a guess and then not even that, they turned and went back inside the keep and did the work the living must do to keep the dead from seeming more numerous than they are. On the ride north, the snow came thinner, and the trees stood in their coats that are not coats, their bones on display without shame. A rider found them 2 days from Winterfell. His horse had sweated into crystals. He had the stiff look of men who have ridden away from a thing they cannot outrun. From Barrowton, he said. From a widow who knows the smell of trouble the way my mare knows the smell of wolves. Pink men in the night. They knew at once what he meant because there is a kind of rumor that grows legs. The flayed men do not approach openly. They do not burn and boast. They take, they weigh, they go. They leave a sigil behind carved where it will never be full of anything again. The man's words fell into old grooves in their minds. The Dreadfort's men had been too quiet for too long. Roose Bolton had sat at Robb's table like a knife set side on, and now someone had turned it and showed its edge. Ramsay, Catelyn said, and tasted where the name had been filed away in her fear. The sun. Robb did not say a word. He looked to the woods where a level of winter had made every path equal. Then he spoke, and it was the careful voice he used when addressing men who take things personally. We will not put a town to the torch to catch a fox, he said. We will set traps where foxes run. They sent word quietly to Howland Reed, to Barbary Dustin, to Tallheart and Glover and Riswell. The marsh answered, as the marsh does, without fanfare. Men of the quiet country appeared in places you would not have thought to look. their faces smeared with a paste the color of rot that had purpose, their spears short and wicked. Lord Ryswell sent 30 riders who could keep silence at a gallop. Lady Dustin sent 20 more whose horses ate snow without stamping. The first trap was sprung in a ditch that had been a road before the road learned better. Ramsay had taken 7 boys from a steading and left 7 sacks of grain. He did not come to collect his own payment. He sent the kind of men who look back over their shoulders when the wind says their names for no reason they can tell you. The spears found them where the snow lay like a lover. 2 lived long enough to give up a name. The third trap took more care. It needed the kind of bait that Robb had sworn he would never use. It needed the rumor of silver and the reality of arrogance. They let talk go out that a caravan of coin and wine for White Harbor would move with a light guard. They let the rumor be heard in places where the Dreadfort's men had sat with their boots too near other men's fires and flicked ash into other men's stew. They let it be taken up by the kind of ears Ramsay liked to pull. Then they loaded a 12 barrels with snow and 3 with stones, and put 2 wineskins into one, because a lie's breath always smells better for a little truth. Ramsay came himself to that one. He had a laugh men remembered as a diminishment. He wore the pink with a wrong kind of pride, and he carried nothing of his father's silences. He came when the sky was a bruise. His men came like ticks. They did not expect a marsh to rise out of hard ground. They did not expect a rope to lift and sing as the white knife, braided of hide and her straps and thrown by men whose grandfathers had thrown eels to shore. They did not expect gray wind. The wolf moved where no wolf had room to move, and then there was room because men make room for wolves or are made into it. Ramsay's horse went down. He came up laughing and drew, and a spear through the meat of his shoulder turned the laugh into something else. He threw the spear back badly and grinned even then, eyes bright with a kind of joy that was not fit for men. He cut a Crannog youth along the arm and would have finished him if Arya had not stepped from nowhere with a little blade and a way of moving that made men blink to see it. Robb's voice cracked across the night. "Alive," he said, and it was a command in one word. Ramsay turned to run and found Howland Reed where no one should have been. A little man with a spear that found the one step not covered by leather. The blade went into Ramsay's calf and the Bolton air came down hard, cursing like a prayer. They bound him. He smiled as if they had put him to bed with a mother. "King," he said to Robb, the word greased with a kind of mockery that had made more dangerous men than he come to regret their pride. "The last king who took me in hand learned my name the slow way. Your father would have killed me clean. Will you?" Robb's hand tightened upon the hilt of his sword and loosened again. He did not draw then. He looked to the Crannog youth with the cut along his arm and to the woman weeping without sound because her boy's breath had gone out of him without even a word, as if it had been shy of leaving. He looked to Caitlin. She did not nod. She did not shake her head. She let him be the man he had to be. In Winterfell's yard, where snow remembers men's names longer than stone does, Ramsay Bolton went to his knees before a block that had seen lords kneel and thieves and once, long ago, a butcher for stealing the high stew. Robb spoke so that all would hear. "You are guilty of more than I can list," he said. "You are guilty of less than all that has been laid at your door by rumor. That is the nature of rumor. It gilds and it lowers. If there were mercy to be had, it would be found with the men whose lives you took and whose skins you thought to wear. There is none there. If there were mercy to be had, it would be found in your father. There is none there I can trust. So I will give you what mercy I have, which is swiftness." He passed sentence and swung the sword. The blade was clean when it came up. The snow received what it receives. The yard did not cheer. It is not a thing to cheer. It is a thing to mark and then carry, like a stone that fits too well in the hand. Roose came 2 days later under a flag that looked like a flinch. He had 20 men and a face like milk left 3 days upon a sill in winter. It did not curdle because nothing does at that cold. It only became what it was more intensely. "My son," he said. "Your son," Robb said. Roose's eyes moved and did not warm. "I did not send him," he said, and there was enough truth in that it rang when you struck it. "I have never been good at parenting. It is a flaw. I rely on punishments when there were other tools I might have tried. They are not as effective as men tell themselves. You may argue that to the dead, Caitlin said. Roose looked at her as if considering the shape of a god's tree. I would not win the argument, he said, mild as milk again. Very well. I will not offer you offense by pleading a father's case. I will ask, rather, what you will do with me. I have men and a keep that has taught men to hate it, and a wife that your wife's kin gave me as if to laugh, and I did not laugh. I accepted a woman who is a kindness if you can see it. I will not take up arms against you. I do not say this because I am afraid. I say this because I am tired. Give me a road that leads north to Black, and I will take it. Caitlin thought of Jeor Mormont and of the men who had found in the cold a kind of washing that other places do not offer. She thought of John's letter and of the thin line of men upon the wall and of what it costs always to hold a line. She did not think of mercy. She thought of utility, of pruning a tree so that the fruit grows better, of keeping poison upon a high shelf in case a worse poison comes. The wall will take you, Robb said. If they will, you will go with 2 of my men for each of yours, and you will go on foot. Your wife will remain at the Dread Fort until we can find her a better hall. Your men will leave their banners in my yard. If you turn aside, I will send men behind you who do not get tired. If you take a life between here and there, I will take yours again. Do you understand me? Roose Bolton's mouth trembled once, as if something had occurred to him that he found amusing and dreadful both. I do, he said. I will go and be a brother among men who hate brothers less than I do. When he left, the air tasted cleaner in some way no one would name. Barbary Dustin came in a week later and put her hands upon the Dreadfort's keys and held them like a thing you mean to hand to a friend and never do. I will keep this bad place, she said, until you find a man who can be trusted with it, or until it collapses on my head, which may be the kinder of the 2 fates. She laughed, and her laugh was sharp, and Caitlin loved her a little for that. White Harbor sent word with fish on the parchment where the ink had bled. The Sweetwater had reached Skagos. Davos wrote in his square hand a message that made the chamber small with the people packed into it, their hope making air thick. A woman with hair like straw and a boy with a wolf had been seen upon a strand of black stones. The boy had growled at the first approach and the wolf had snapped at the second, and then the smuggler had done what decent men do when wolves are involved. He had gone still and let the thing with teeth do the thinking. The second letter came like the song You Are Afraid to Hope will be repeated. Davos said the boy was fierce and the woman wary, and the island old with old habits that make the word cannibal sound too simple for what men do when winter has no pity. He would bring them by stealth and by favor. He begged bread and blankets at a place on the coast beneath cliffs a man could mistake for the very end of land. He named the day and the hour he would make for it if the sea did not decide to hand him to a different shore. They rowed. Robb took only those he would take into a burning house. The Blackfish, Torman Whiteblade, 𝒔𝒕𝒊𝒄𝒆 Mormont's eldest who had a sword and a sense. Caitlin went. She would have walked naked if it got her there faster. The path to the sea wound along where the land had been bitten and bitten by waves for longer than any man, and the smell of salt was foreign and honest, like a stranger's good advice. They built no fires. They stood against stones that had been sand once and listened to the sea breathe. The Sweetwater came up out of gray with her sails furled, oars working like patient legs. She beached without ceremony. Davos stepped out first, boots in water, put his hand on the prow as if to thank it, and turned. He had 2 shapes behind him. Osha, she had been Osha then and she was Osha now, came after in a coat made of something that had been alive and tougher than it looked, and in her arms there was a boy whose eyes were too wide because they had learned too many distances too soon. Shaggy Dog came last, the wolf bigger than a man remembers until he sees one again. His eyes that stark green that has soot in it and sunlight both. Rickon squirmed and slid feet first, landing like a cat and turning that look upon the shore as if to bite it for being where it was. His hair had grown into a wild thing that would have caused an ant to produce a comb with a tut. He stood and looked at Robb without recognition, and then with it, and his lip went out in a way that was not weakness but the body's confession of helpless joy. He did not run. He walked, and then in the next heartbeat he was a small boy again and ran, and he hit his brother with a force that made Robb rock back and then down on one knee, and Shaggy Dog and Grey Wind circled and bumped and snarled and did not bite because their world, like the men's, had gotten better without getting easier. Caitlin did not speak. She took Rickon when Rickon turned with that greedy child need to be held and buried her face in his hair that smelled of salt and animal. And the first tears slid, and she did not mind that anyone saw. Osha stood a little apart, smiling with the careful pride of a gardener who has kept a tree alive in a room without windows and now watches it be put back in the light. "He wouldn't die," Osha said simply. "I wouldn't let him, but he wouldn't neither. He bites like his wolf, and there's a thing inside him. It's a good thing. I've seen boys with bad things inside. He's not that. He's a winter boy with a summer in him yet." Robb went to Davos and stood a moment with him in the noise where the sea speaks and men pretend they understand. "If I had another crown," he said, "I'd put it on you. Instead, I have a debt that the North will pay when you come where we can pay it." Davos shrugged as if to dislodge the honor before it could settle. "Pay Stannis with ships," he said. "Pay the wall with bread. Pay me with a bed near a fire and a bowl of something that reminds a man there's more to life than salt. That'll do." They went north by slow roads with many eyes. Rumor travels as a second caravan. It reached Winterfell before they did and made the hall into a bell that rang and rang. When Rickon came through the gate, he swung his legs to the side of the saddle and dropped off and ran the last 20 yards on those legs. And he tripped and skinned a knee and did not care, and Caitlyn's laugh broke again, and the men in the yard pretended to look at the sky. Rosalind took the boy's face between her hands and kissed his forehead and then his cheek. Her own son toddled from her skirts with a look of outrage that the hierarchy had been disturbed by affection, and then he broke into giggles because Rickon tickled him under the chin as if they had been born to it. They feasted that night as well as winter permits. That is to say, they feasted with eyes and with stories and with the thump of cups on wood. Osha sat at the end of the high table, a place she kept as if she had never imagined it and never lusted for it and could appreciate it without either sin. She drank only enough to warm her up to her own smile. She looked at the walls and then at the boy eating meat with his fingers and shook her head once and swore under her breath that men and their stone boxes were the strangest, luckiest fools. John's next letter came as if it had known to wait until there was warmth enough to read without cursing. He wrote of Hardhome again, of the things they had brought off the beach and the things they had left because men cannot save everything, and if they try, the sea teaches them a different lesson than the one they meant to learn. He wrote of a woman who was a wildling and a mother and a disappointment to anyone who likes clean lines drawn across maps. He wrote of the giant who had died at the gate and of fire that burns blue when it wants to frighten more. He wrote with no poetry and made poetry anyway. "Do not send me kings," he ended. "Send me carpenters and men with sharp eyes. Send me onion sacks that do not rot when a tear forms. Send me boys who can fetch and not ask why. Send me men who can be told why and not ask to be excused. Send me word that you will hold the lands the wall defends. That is the one promise I would bank if I were a lord with a mind for such things." Robb sent him men who had been carpenters before they had been soldiers. He sent him sacks and needles and thread and salt and more bread than he could afford. He sent him a promise written not only upon paper but upon the land. He sent men to every holdfast from Last Hearth to Bear Island with orders that were not orders so much as a plea written in the shape of his authority. Keep grain aside for the watch. Keep a hall set aside for men who come late and wet and armed with oaths instead of coin. Sansa's tidings came on a strip of silk that had been stitched and then carefully unpicked, because there are eyes that read words and eyes that read seams. She wrote as Elaine Stone and as Sansa both. She wrote with a grace that hid iron in its hem. She wrote of Peter Baelish as a man who carries a smile like a blade tucked in a sleeve, and of Lords of the Vale who had forgotten that the world does not end where the stone drops away into mist. "I will not come yet," she wrote in thread the color of a clear sky. "I will make of this mountain a friend if I can, for the day when you will need it to lean against. Do not write. Do not send a man with a letter in his boot. Trust that I am well enough. Trust that I have not forgotten the gods would. By grain. I do not know why I write that. I am sure you do. Robb did buy grain, at prices that made Maester Colrin groan and Wyman laugh and then grumble and then laugh again. Grain is a crown when snow is king. He paid in furs and iron and promises, and in turn he demanded promises that had teeth in them. White Harbor's warehouses filled and emptied and filled again, a breathing that matched the sea's own. The South played its games and lost itself sometimes in the maze of its own making. Word came of Circe and the faith and of a queen's walk, and the men who brought it laughed and put hands before their faces as if the shame could blow up the road and strike them. Robb listened and did not let his face show the utter indifference these stories earned in a yard where the snow had to be cleared and men had to be fed or the world would simply stop. The Ironborn stirred like eels in a pot. Asha sent a letter from a cell with a piece of bone sharpened on stone, telling the Starks without apology where she would prefer to die and where she would be willing to live. "Give me a boat and a bad wind," she wrote. "I will make you a harbor. Keep me in this cage and I will make someone sorry in the end. It may be you. It may be me. It will certainly be someone." 𝒔𝒕𝒉 laughed and sent her fish and a blanket and later sent her to Deepwood Mott's yard to split kindling for 2 weeks, running beside a bear of a man who had never learned to say please to a woman and learned it in that time with special speed. Spring came in halting measures. It is a liar, spring, especially in the north. It took a day to teach the lesson of hope and a week to go back to winter to 𝒔𝒊𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒄 gullibility. When it finally sat down to stay, it did so with a sigh, and grass pushed through where men's boots had pressed it flat all winter, stubborn and green. New lambs staggered about like drunken courtiers. The gods would smelled wet and alive. They held a small thing that had a large shape to it. And oath-taking. Men who had sat out the winter as soldiers returned to being carpenters and herdsmen and fishers. Men who had held swords by the blade handed them back and asked for plowshares. Robb stood upon the steps with Rickon and his own son upon either side, and the swords battered against shields in a rhythm that was not war and not peace and nevertheless their own. "I name Rickon my heir if the worst takes my own line," Robb said quietly, not to boast but to put a stone where a path must go. He looked at Rosalind, who nodded, and at Caitlin, whose mouth firmed in pride and sorrow in equal measure. He looked at Arya, who had slipped into the back of the hall and leaned against a pillar with the look of someone trying to decide if she belonged to stone or to air. When his eyes found her, she lifted her chin as if to say, "Both, for now." Later that night, Arya sat with him in the yard, their feet dirty with the day's thaw and their cloaks around shoulders that had learned to grow straight despite weight. "I will go away again," she said. It was not a question or a plea. It was a thing said as fact, like the tide. "I know," Robb said, and there was no hurt in it. He had learned that to keep a thing which was not yours to keep is to ruin it. "Write if you wish, or come as a crow comes, without announcement." She smiled, a flash and gone. "Crows speak too much," she said. "I will come as a shadow when I want a warm meal." She touched his hand in a way that was a child's and not. Then she was up and gone into the dark with a speed that would have made a cat wonder. Gray Wind huffed and did not like it. He would have put all the wolves where he could count them at night if the world had been made by wolves. The next winter, they said, would be longer. Maesters said it like men say things to prove they still know what they know. John sent word of dead things in lakes that should not move and of men with blue eyes that made a noise of silence when they died. A silence as heavy as a dropped bar of iron. He asked for dragonglass and got it. He asked for a thing no one can ask for, dragons, and did not get it. He did not chide anyone for failing to send what cannot be sent. Davos left again, because the sea waits for men like him to remember what they are. He carried letters that were not letters but breath, to Stannis with numbers that mattered and to a woman with eyes like embers telling her that a Northman will stand when his legs are numb and his heart is a stone. He took with him a brace of carpenters and a box of needles and the memory of a hall where a boy had been found alive because a woman had refused to die and a smuggler had known when to be still. In time, the Vale sent knights down the high road with cloaks as blue as a promise finally kept. Sansa held no title and commanded no men. Men obeyed anyway. Littlefinger learned that webs do not hold when the temperature falls below a certain point. The lords of the Vale took a look at the world and decided that they would rather be spoken of by their grandchildren as fools who came late than by no one at all as ghosts who never went. Marjorie Tyrell sent a cake with green icing in the shape of a rose, and a letter with condolences and the gentle suggestion that perhaps the Riverlands might be happier with winters the Crown's roads could help them weather. Caitlin sent back a cuff for a little girl made in needlework by her own hand and a line that said, simply, "We have roads enough," and the grace to expect that the Queen would understand. Marjorie did. There are women who read better than men will ever admit. If there was a day when the world changed, no one wrote it down. If there was a moment when the dead surged and returned, no song captured it accurately, because distance eats detail and men like better a tidy lie than the honest mess the living must wade through. There were instead 1,000 days and 1,000 nights, some full of screaming and some full of nothing more than the sound water makes when it decides to become ice. There were fasts and farts, prayers and swears, the long, uninteresting work of survival, and the single beautiful eyes open moments when a boy laughed in a hall where once there had been fear. Robb grew the small belly of a man who eats what he tells others to eat. He wore the lines around his eyes that honor gives and takes. He swung his sword when he must and laid it down when he could, and learned to speak to girls whose fathers had died without sounding as if he were auditioning for a song. He did not become a hero. He did something harder. He became a king in a place where kings are less use than bread. Rosalind played the harp when the wind would let her and taught her son that names matter and numbers do too. She taught him the way her father had taught her to count dinners, and then she taught him to soften counts with kindness, which Walder had never learned. When men came to Winterfell's yard in the spring that followed a winter longer than a decent tale would allow, they found a hall that was full without swagger. They found a woman with auburn hair who could look at a map and at a child with equal attention. They found a queen whose lists included candles and carpenters in the same hand as spears. They found a small boy who had survived an island that eats outsiders, and a large boy who had learned to share his wolf with another. They found a girl who came and went and did not smile often and had not forgotten how. They found that the gods would still smelled like a place that does not care whether men are good or bad but watches to see if they can be better than they were. In the end, as in all ends that are not quite endings, there was a night when Robb went again to the heart tree and set his palm to it. The bark was rough. There is comfort in what does not change when all around it does. Snow fell in lazy flakes that did not commit to the ground. He stood and listened and did not ask for anything. There were no answers except the answer that had sustained him all this time, which is that the work is the prayer, and the prayer is the work, and the man who keeps faith with both does not need an omen. Behind him, footsteps. Caitlin came and stood with him without shiver. "I dreamed last night," she said, "of your father. He was mending a spear and told me I was doing it wrong. I told him I never learned. He said, 'You learned what you had to, cat.' Then he kissed my hair, and the dream ended before I could make of it a sermon." Robb smiled, not with his mouth. "Sometimes that is best." She put her hand in the crook of his arm. "You have done it," she said, and did not specify what it was. "Tomorrow there will be another it." He nodded. The snow chose then to stick, a little, upon his shoulder. Gray wind shook himself somewhere beyond, and a shower of white made a temporary constellation in the air. "Come inside," Caitlin said. "Your son has decided bread is a toy, and he needs a king to tell him otherwise." He went. The heart tree watched him go with a face that had watched more kings than songs can count come and go, and it did not remember their names, only the weight of their hands and the sound their boots made on the snow. In the south, the bells rang for another wedding and another war. In the east, a dragon wheeled over a city and frightened men into best behavior for an afternoon. On the wall, a boy with black in his cloak and stubbornness in his jaw argued with a king and did not back down, and neither did the king, and somehow the world did not split because neither did the wall. In the twins, a man counted his dinners and then forgot what number he had reached and laughed out loud and did not know why. In White Harbor, a man who had lost more sons than a man should lighted a candle in a little chapel he had built to a god he did not claim, and the flame burned steady. In the Dreadfort, Barbary Dustin hung a new banner she disliked less than the old and told the walls to stop whispering, and they did a little. And in Winterfell, a woman played a harp and a boy ran and fell and got up again with a howl that was not pain but the announcement of being alive. A king turned a ledger page. A wolf in the gods wood lifted his head and scented the air. The snow kept falling with that stubborn, unreproachable grace that makes men feel small and held all at once. The work waited. The world, battered and foolish, continued. And the North remembered, as it always had, not simply a name or a crown, but a manner of standing when the wind comes, and of offering a door when the wind is too much for any one man.